Good morning. Welcome. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on language in our worship. I want to allow some time for us to have a conversation together before all is said and done. But before we get there, a couple of preliminaries. Last week we had part 1. This is part 2. I was just going to offer a word of thanks. Whether you were here or not, I was going to do that. Thanks for all that you shared with us last week. Thanks for your raising of some of these concerns. And I do want to just briefly allow, as I did say privately to Betsy after the service last week, it's a good reminder in a couple of ways. And one of the very small but subtle things that, because of this reminder last week in particular, last week's sermon we had a parable of a landowner and the laborers. And in the parable, in Greek, as you might know, as in Spanish and many other languages, most words have male and female gender assignments. And the landowner was identified just by the word itself as a male, and the pronoun used around it was masculine. And there's no surprise there. Of course it was a man. In that culture it would have been a man. And there was nothing wrong if I had gone on in my sermon to refer to him using a pronoun from time to time, but it did occur to me that there was nothing necessarily added to the sermon by reminding you he was a man, in this case, because I wasn't dealing with all of the other roles and everything else. I was telling a different story. And so I just made a point of not using the masculine pronoun. Very subtle. It wasn't terribly profound. I hope you didn't notice, because I wasn't trying to draw attention to anything to make a point. I was just trying to be a little careful. And I think if nothing else comes of these conversations, a reminder to be careful in how we use our language and the impact it has on others is helpful. So thank you, Betsy. If nothing else, for at least that. For at least that. Recap what it is Betsy presented last week for the benefit of those who were here to remind us and for the benefit of those who weren't. These were, as I understand it, sort of the essential points of the presentation. To recall the frame of reference, last week was the end of our welcome week, and so there was a question of what does our language do to welcome people? That was part of the frame of reference, I think. Betsy, keep me honest on this. And a question of why it's important and where we need to put our attention, and I'm going to remind you of that in just a moment. Basically, it comes down to liturgy and lectionaries, I think. And the bottom line for all of us. That's
hymnology. Hymnology.
Well, we're going to come to that. That wasn't part of the presentation. I'm recapping the presentation. And this is one of Betsy's statements. Just took it right off her slide. One of the ways this is Betsy, I believe we could beneficially improve as a parish community is to make our liturgical language more welcoming. Okay? And then a couple of statements from the UCC Church from the late 90s. Use of only masculine nouns and pronouns for God, and of masculine generic terms for humankind, has hidden the rich feminine imagery for God and God's people in Scripture. And then finally this, inclusive language is far more than an aesthetic matter. It is a fundamental issue of social justice. Language that is truly inclusive affirms sexuality, racial, and ethnic background. So that was by way of background, and this is, I think, kind of where we were heading in the end of this conversation last week, is these gender issues and issues of anti-Semitism, which I haven't really touched on as yet today. Both issues are reflected, and we want to think about them in terms of parish bulletins on Sundays, the lectionary readings, and the Book of Common Prayer, which is certainly the backbone of our traditions worship today. And the bottom line, the faithful recognize our call to be welcoming to all, in accord with our Trinity mission, and to do what it takes for the language we use to reflect that welcome in accord with our faith and tradition. Okay. So that was last week. Now I just wanted to pause before we do anything else and ask if there are questions, responses, reactions, or additional comments that you might want to make following last week. And again, reminding we want to leave room for this week's conversation too. So, anything? Is this clear as mud? All right. Well, all right then. We'll move on into today's conversation. I want to make a couple of preliminary observations before I kind of invite the panel to join me much, because it seems to me some of what falls to me is different than it falls to just everybody else. And so I just kind of want to, as much as I can, own that and stand and be accountable to you on that. The first thing I want to say to you is a question of our identity and mission and who we are, and my responsibility as it fits into all of that. In particular, as an ordained person, because there are promises that ordained people make that aren't necessarily made by others. And as rector, and there's, I find myself feeling just a little bit sometimes caught between horns of dilemmas. A little bit. But this is something we've been playing with, this kind of imagery and statement of who we are at Trinity. And I'm comfortable with it because I think this says something about my understanding of where I am. Rooted and rooted, boy, it's such a rich term. It's full of all sorts of things for me. It's rooted in a tradition. It means, in part, rooted in a way of looking at the world which is distinctive from perhaps other branches of Christianity. And so that's a piece of what's important here. And open. And so it's part of my sense of our tradition is that our tradition broadly, not just Trinity in particular, but broadly, our tradition is one that has attempted to maintain our roots and still be open to new ways of doing things. And that goes back to the English Reformation, if not before. And certainly the Episcopal Church in these United States and now beyond. And then the question of how it is that we're growing. A particular expression of that, then, has been the way in which I've approached use of liturgies, really for probably, 20 years? I'm trying to think since going back to my time in Libertyville, where I began talking about summer staycations. In Libertyville, Illinois, it was just a summer staycation. And we went and used the prayer book through the rest of the year. But in the summer, we took a break. And so that was, particularly intended then to function a little differently, I think, than the way we use it here. I was very adamantly trying to make sure that I was sharing with my congregation then what's going on in the wider Anglican community. What's going on in particular, the obvious one to go to in those days was the Church of New Zealand, which had a brand new prayer book back then, which was very different in some respects than what we're using, although it's still Anglican and profoundly Anglican. And then as other resources were introduced in places like Ireland and in England and in Canada, I would use those. And then somebody would find a liturgy from South Africa, and they would share it with me, and I would find a way to use that. I wasn't always trying to do inclusive language, but I was trying to widen our sense of what goes on in the Anglican communion. Because my sense is part of my job, in particular as a rector, but more broadly as an ordained person, part of my job is to prepare the congregation for the fact that this stuff is in the mix. And conversations are going on. And back in the 70s, when a new prayer book was dumped on some congregations, there were some congregations not prepared. And that was a disservice, and it seems to me a shirking of some responsibility on the part of the clergy to prepare their congregations for a future that's coming. So I want to make sure that the people I serve know this stuff is being talked about. So change is in the air. And it's not just the Episcopal Church being sort of typically American and avant-garde. This is going on everywhere. So that was a piece of it. And then enriching our worship is our own particular Episcopal innovation, trying to play with it. So that's part of the job. And part of the job, which is why we always have returned home, is to remind you that the Book of Common Prayer is the current expression of our tradition. So it's trying to keep a foot in both sides of that. That's part of what I see to be my job, my calling, my particular responsibility. And this is just, I did a review just to remind myself a little bit of where we've been this past year. And part of it was helpful for me to realize I've got to change some things up this next year a little bit, assuming we go ahead with the same pattern. But in Advent, starting with the beginning of the year, we did prayers for an inclusive church, a seasonal variant for Advent, with additional materials from Episcopal Church in Coralville, Iowa. We went then to Eucharistic Prayer B, so the pattern went back to the prayer book with an alternative seasonal affirmation. Continue with Eucharistic Prayer B in Epiphany. And then we went with another seasonal liturgy from Prayers for an Inclusive Church in Lent, and another seasonal variant on both the prayers and the affirmation of faith. And then in the Easter season, back to Eucharistic Prayer B. And this is what I learned, was that although I do A and C in particular at the other 8 o'clock service, at the 10 o'clock service, the 10:15 service, all I've done this last year is Eucharistic Prayer B. Apart from the Holy Days, which has some different mixes, but that was an interesting insight for me. So I have to mix it up, assuming we go with that pattern. And then in the summer, we did New Zealand from sort of mid to early June through the mid part of July, and then Church of Canada from mid-July to early September, and then since then, I'm thinking kind of at this point through mid-October with the current Celtic Iona service, and then Eucharistic Prayer A. I'm thinking for the remainder of the season before Advent. It's kind of where I think it is right now, but it's all in play a little. The added observation that I wanted to share with you is it does seem to me that for all of this, we didn't talk about it, but the hymnal is problematic as well. And I might argue, Betsy, more problematic. We talked about it just a little bit, some of us informally beforehand, partly because if you wanted to change hymns, I think you might run into more resistance from the part of some. And what we do in our hymns is usually done without thinking about it. We just sing the old hymns because we love the old hymns. We don't necessarily think about it. So, with that in mind, I point out one of the hymns we're doing. By the way, I'll tell you now, the next service, I think this is the closing hymn, verses 1, 4, 5, and 7. We're going to skip the asterisked verses, so do make a note of that when we get ready for it. It's a great hymn. This is we always do something like this for St. Francis Day celebrations, whether it's on St. Francis Day or not. And it's got some good stuff. Some expansive imagery for God. We've got Dear Mother Earth, which isn't really about God, but it's hard to think it's not. It's just got, even you, most gentle death, waiting, it's not about God, but it is, it's just this lovely hymn, rich with all sorts of imagery. Let all things their Creator bless. But it also then weaves through here, God is consistently referred to, even in the verse about old Mother Earth, as Him. So, if you need permission, go ahead and play with the pronouns when you sing today. But my guess is it's probably going to make a lot of you uncomfortable to do that. So, it's a lovely hymn, so rich in many ways, and yet, so hymns, it seems to me, are almost more problematic than the rest of what we've talked about so far. All right, we'll try and talk less now. We have the A-team here. Welcome to the A-team, or at least part of them. We're missing Celine. Celine had to be out of town this weekend, so we don't have Celine. But we do have John Collins, Gay Lawson, Mary Ann Borg, and Jeff Bullock. Yay, thank you very much. Bill Ellis is also not here. Now, I have invited Bill into the A-team, but Bill has so far refused, or declined, excuse me. He's been very gracious about it, but he thinks, no. But he tells me maybe after the first of the year. So, anyhow, we get together from time to time and we have conversations which are lovely. And it's a shame sometimes, I think to myself, that you all don't get to hear what we talk about. So now you get to hear what we talk about sometimes. So, we're going to have a conversation, hopefully keeping ourselves restrained, which is hard, speaking for myself. And leave a little bit of time for you. What was said back there?
He was affirming your statement.
Oh, okay. Good. All right. So, I want to begin with an observation that we have in our canons. Some translations authorized for worship, and this is the list, and this is what we typically use at Trinity. And in my experience, and I'll invite you all to talk about this. In my experience, the New Revised Standard Version is what most Episcopal churches use. Do you want to say anything more about that? About why, maybe?
I think it's just been tradition.
Well, it wasn't tradition before 1990.
I think
Yeah, but
if I
since
may,
then, it's become
maybe
tradition.
I think it's standardized, as was the RSV before it, for just about all mainline seminary education. And so by the time it got, and there was quite a fight behind the RSV. People forget about that, but it was burned in certain parts of the United States when it first came out. So people responded very strongly to the RSV, and the RSV is a modest update to that. But I think it's chiefly because most of us were educated in it.
So most of us, when you say most of us, you're talking now specifically about those of us in the Episcopal Church and...
Methodists,
Methodist,
Presbyterians, you name it.
So there's an ecumenical flavor to it too.
I think it's the most common that way, yes.
Anything else you want to say about that? That's our list.
I think some would suggest that the RSV is the most reliable translation. It may not be ultimately definitive, but it's the most reliable. So the Revised Standard Version has been part of our mainstay, and then there were some revisions made in an attempt to be a little bit more inclusive.
One thing I would say to you that directly pertains to this language issue is that none of them are reliable in the sense that they give you an authentic sense of the Greek. They all are, and I joke about this, but they're largely translated by middle-aged white males who are affluent enough to get a PhD in England, okay? And there's some requirements that go along with that are going to capture you by culture. And they're difficult to break out of those culture because you can't see it from when you're inside that glass house. But of late, in the last decade or so, there have been some remarkable translations that challenge this. Many of them are outside of English, but there have been some within English. One recently came out. There's an iconoclastic theologian by the name of David Bentley Hart, and he just came out with a translation of the New Testament that's meant to reflect more the rhythm and the language of the first century church, and how challenging and abrupt that might be to people. I think probably one of the most famous or infamous translations I was thinking about this morning in the Lord's Prayer. We say we forgive others as we've been forgiven. Unfortunately, that doesn't really reflect what the Bible says in the Greek. The Greek is convoluted because of the changes in verb tense. But fundamentally, one way to say it in a longer expression would be, remind us, God, that we are forgiven and other people are forgiven as well. And that's a much more, to my mind, accurate translation of the Greek, and dramatically changes the quality of that. And there's one other example of it that's very familiar to us who've grown up as evangelical traditions like I did, is believe in Jesus. You know that expression, believe in Jesus? Well, more teeth have been broken over prepositions than anything else, because it's the faith more commonly translated in the ancient world of Jesus. So in one case, if you believe in Jesus, then you're utterly dependent on Jesus, you see. But if you're following in the faith of Jesus, then the instrumental faith depends on you. It's you have to cultivate it. Lots of people like to turn it over to Jesus and say, well, Jesus didn't intervene on my behalf. Who cares? But if it's left up to me to live as Jesus lived, then you have another issue. So those translations, and they're diverse, there are many of them out there. We don't see them often, but you can find the David Bentley Hart. You can find Matthew and Mark online if you want as an example of that. And you'll find it just a little bit different. I might enjoy it.
Well, you bring up a point. This is one of my observations that we've talked about a little bit, that every act of translating is in fact an act of interpretation, which is something we easily forget, because it just gets printed to you in England or in English. And the old fundamentalist perspective is God said it, I believe it, and that settles it, right?
Yeah.
Unless, even if we thought that the original Hebrew and or original Greek texts were, the fail-safe, none of us use those languages None of us use those languages. And even though some of us might have a little training in it, none of this group, I don't believe, is really qualified to translate the Bible. So you're always getting an interpretation. The question then is whose? And I put up there, why do you call me Lord? Or to fill out that particular verse, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? That's the NRSV, or the Inclusive Bible. Why do you call out, Rabbi, Rabbi, but don't put into practice what I teach you? Now, care to deal with those interpretations? What's the difference between those? Rabbi can be a woman, okay, a point in its favor.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something lost?
Well, rabbi is not necessarily a lord, or the Lord. So I think there is a difference.
I have two comments. One is, but you do not do what I tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very different kind of directive than what the second one suggests about you putting into practice. So that's a different thing. One thing I want to just say as we explore this stuff is, when we talk about translation, I think it's important that we remind ourselves, what kind of document is the Bible? Because I think that if we are concerned that we are translating the words of quote-unquote God in a certain, it's like, God said it. But, and this may sound controversial to some, but the Bible it's inspired, it's a response to our experience of God, and all sacred literature is. I think that it's a response to our experience of the holy, of the sacred, of death, of life, of ambiguity, of things we can't control, of what is human nature. And so the Bible is a conversation in ancient communities around some of these issues. It's a response to the sacred, but it's, if you don't mind my saying so, it's a human product. It's a human response to our conundrums and curiosities and experiences of what it is to live. And how do we find meaning in this? And how do we find what is the nature of reality? And so Old Testament, New Testament, Hebrew Bible, New Testament it's a conversation that we get to experience of ancient communities talking about these things. So when we're talking about translations, I just want us to keep in mind that translations are going to vary depending upon the sort of cultural linguistic lenses that we see these things through, what's available to us in terms of how we understand language, what scholars can offer us. But then as we interact with Scripture, I think it's important for us to reflect, and we don't have to do that this morning, but reflect on what is the nature of our Scripture. Because I think we get really offended if we think, well, God said this. And it's like, maybe we can discern the spirit of the holy in something. Or yes, that sounds like the wisdom of reality. But I think that when we talk about biblical translation and when we talk about the nature of the Bible and we start parsing things out, I just think it's important that we remember the context, that the Bible is a human product. And that doesn't make it any less. In fact, if anything, it's a window into the searching of the heart and soul of humanity over generations and generations and generations. And I think one reason that the Bible continues to speak to us today is because it speaks about the human condition. And that is the way we recognize it. So I don't mean that to be a diversion, but I just wanted to make a point about the nature of the Bible as what kind of a document is it.
I think it's kind of complicated. Marianne and I have been friends for many, many years, since she was in my youth group. We do come down on different sides on this,
We do.
which she will quickly acknowledge. And so let me give a hands-on example that I think speaks directly to what Betsy's talking about. I don't question that human beings wrote down the Bible. I have no question about that. And of course, as I just said, anytime somebody writes something down, they're part of the cultural trap of the cultural community in which they live. So the problem with the Lord's Prayer translation, it's capital exchange. I'll give you if you give me. But you don't hear Jesus ever proclaim that, ever, anytime in the New Testament. In fact, he says the exact opposite in many respects. But one point I want to make to you about the place of women in the Bible. People often complain, well, it's Jesus and he's male image and all that sort of thing. I hear that. But take this on for a moment and think about it. Rowan Williams talks about this at length. Jesus came into the world to set things right. I believe that. And I think Marianne does too. I mean, that's chiefly an issue of justice. Whether he's divine or not, I think he's divine. I don't know how other people feel. But he came into the world for that purpose. And one of the points I want to make to you is in that encounter, it was almost necessary for him as a man to witness to the critical center of women in the New Testament. And it's as simple as this. Who was the first one to recognize that Jesus was the Savior? His mother. And Elizabeth, right? Mm-hmm. Who were the ones that followed him first? Women. Mm-hmm. Who were the ones that stuck with him? Mm-hmm. Who were with him at the foot of the cross? Mm-hmm. Who were the first ones that Jesus rose to? What's the message here? I mean, I've preached that time and time again, and I have had people so angry with me for saying that I think you recognize by that it cuts to the very core of the message of Jesus, which is presence, 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 presence again. I think Jesus came to set the world right. I think Mary, the Mother of God, came to set the world right. And to make it right was to put women in places of justice. So that's an example, I think, of wrestling with that kind of language. And I remind you, the language is not limited to words by any measure. Our Sunday morning language of the Eucharist is reciprocal, egalitarian. We're all in this together. We take communion. We look at one another. We care about one another. We all do exactly the same thing. What language does that say? I think that's one of the problems with some communities, that they don't care for having communion on a regular basis because it's so egalitarian. It so levels the playing field. We all get the same thing in the end. Sermon over.
One of the things that both of you are talking about, and one of the things that I think was brought up to me by what Bill Ellis said last week, is that the language issues that we have with the Holy Week scriptures that vilify and historically have vilified Jews, with Jews being named over and over and over again. What Jeff is talking about is the long history of women in the Bible and the importance of women in the Bible. The whole language of the Bible and what translation we use and the whole biblical language. What we have lacked is the adequate education to show people those kinds of contrasts, and having Bible as something that we actively study. Other than sermon on Sunday morning, it isn't an active study that we do to try to open people's eyes to what we're talking about. And so I think that as we change language, or we change liturgy, or we change any of our structure, we need to have a component that is an educational component that goes along with why this needs to happen. Because, you know, with all of us in school, the Constitution is a good example to put up against what we're talking about. We don't interpret the Constitution based on no knowledge of what it says. We all know what it says from civics class and all of the education that we had when we went through high school. We have an idea of what the Constitution says. We don't do that as well as we should in the church of getting people educated as to what all this is all about. What are we talking about?
I agree that education around biblical education is really, really important. And I just want to make a quick piggyback on, I wasn't here last week, but you are so right about the Gospel of John, for instance, that it was an intra-Jewish struggle. So when we read the Gospel of John and know that when they say the Jews, they're talking about those Jews. It's like those Episcopalians, you know, in New Zealand that just don't, you know. So it's an intra-Jewish struggle. But our not understanding that has created an anti-Semitism that, I mean, it is inexcusable in this day and age that we should make that category mistake. Mm-hmm. So, and that's a task of education. I want to say something about women in the Bible. If you understand that in the first century world, women did not have the authority, okay? I would say that the way that the narrative of the Bible, the authors of the New Testament, why I think it's so interesting that women were placed in the role of being a witness or whatever is because the culture of those days knew that women didn't have the authority. So it isn't as though Jesus came to give women that role to make it right. It's that the ones that were writing the narratives realized how radical the message of Jesus was and the love of God for all of us. So they had the women be the witnesses, which for a first century audience would have been radical. It's like, you know, their witness wouldn't have counted for anything. And yet, they're the ones that were written into the narrative. Now, I find that really interesting.
And really critical. They are the primary witnesses. And it turns the world upside down. Just as Jesus turned the world upside down economically, I think Jesus turned the world upside down in a way so that we needed to see it, where women had full equality. And that world is a very different world from even now, today. I mean, we don't accept that realistically. And we need to accept that. We need to think about that.
The narrative becomes subversive.
Yes, I agree. A good term for it.
Yes, ma'am.
It just seems so ironic with half of the world roughly being female and churches wanting to grow and become more relevant at a time when particularly traditional ones are less so. And in the face of Christianity having been hijacked, as the bishop said, by some groups that make it more and more unattractive to young people, that we wouldn't jump at the chance to unpack this the way you're speaking. And I'm going to use a business term, market and brand our versions of Christianity in a way that would let people see this. I mean, there's scholarship about it, there's data, and how powerful it would be. I think a lot of people say, oh, well, it's in the Bible, and roll their eyes.
Right.
And it's well, you get my point. It's just like so ironic. Why are we doing this to ourselves? What are the reasons that those with decision-making power, other than, say, hard work and economics, won't go there? It seems so obviously a successful. We would gain more than we would lose, I think.
And what's your hunch on that, Chris, as to why do you think that isn't happening?
Well, most of the time when we have trouble with something, it's because we're afraid of things. And it would cause a lot of loss of positional power and challenge people to be out of their comfort zones and to feel quite at risk in the world as they know it. But I don't know why we couldn't handle that somehow. And I'm very naive about what goes on at, church leadership levels. I know nothing.
I wonder if it's that we think we're already over it. In other words, it's the same thing as racism and being an active feminist in the 70s. The fact that women are where they are right now, an 18-year-old woman has no idea what the world looked like in 1965. Not a clue. And so we've come through all of that strife and think we've gotten to the other side. It's just like racism. It's exactly the same thing. We think we're there, and we don't have to talk about it anymore because we've already solved all those problems.
That's a great analogy.
And I think it goes back to what do we think what is the Bible? What kind of book? And actually, ta Biblia means many books. What kind of books do we think this is? And I still think that is a fundamental question to be asked. Because if people think that this is the epistema verba of God, then then why the Bible is important, or how they use it, or what they feel they're defending, that's a totally different conversation.
Very hard to change if it's right out of God's lips.
It is. And I think that's, that what is the nature and character and quality of the Bible, I think I think the two really pressing issues, and I think of the last century it is, what is the nature of the Bible? What kind of document is it? And I think for this century, it's how do we talk about God? What is God?
And Marianne, one thing I keep thinking about is the feminine movement took things a little bit this way, and many women took up male characteristics and became more aggressive, etc. I think the main thing, at least for me to remember, is that we're not looking for any kind of feminine dominance. We're not looking for any kind of feminine takeover of the Bible, but to make things equal. And I think this is what you're saying, but to really get that this is not a radical movement. But it is, but it's...
Well, and the paradox is that the Bible was written in, like the New Testament, very patriarchal society.
But if you go
And
back...
it was not actually, strangely enough, it wasn't written for us. The Bible was not written for us. It was written for that community. And it was a very patriarchal community.
But if you go back to the Aramaic language, which Jesus spoke, and the people of Judea spoke, where he lived, there's a lot of feminine dress. I mean, there's misrepresentation of words like kingdom, should have been queendom, or it was translated queendom, or I think Marcus talks about this a lot. So,
Well, and just because the Bible comes out of a patriarchal culture doesn't mean that our, how do I want to put this? There is a radical message in the Bible about egalitarianism that comes through even amidst a patriarchal culture. And that's what's interesting about it. But to deny the fact that it comes out of a patriarchal culture undermines, in some ways, some of the subversive teaching that's in the Bible.
I don't think you can keep that message down ultimately. And in the history, this is the anniversary, 500th anniversary of the Reformation. You cannot suppress this language. You cannot suppress this movement. I mean,
This
even
movement
Martin Luther tried to keep
Egalitarian
the
movement? What are you talking
subversive quality.
Oh, the subversive.
And you can't keep that suppressed. You to put the Bible in people's hands. I mean, in the history of the world, every time we put the Bible into people's hands, those people revolt. They don't want to be suppressed on those grounds. And the official narrative is always undermined by that, I love that term, subversive quality of the Bible. I don't care one way or another who wrote it down. But if you take the narrative of Jesus and how Jesus encountered people around him and how he dealt with them, those qualities, that story that penetrate any effort to report on it, make a huge difference. And we have stories like that throughout the Bible. Look at the story of David. People ignore this constantly, but David was immoral, aggressive, self-serving.
He was a cad.
And now, let's not even talk about Bathsheba. But but the point of the matter is, what do we take away from that story? Well, one of the things I take away is if God could forgive David, simple thing here, God can forgive Jeff.
Well, and I would add to that, the whole narrative that we've been reading since Pentecost, these stories from Genesis and now into Exodus, are constantly reminding us of these crabby, grumpy, complaining, whining people, and some of the interactions between siblings and everything else. And just a little bit further to your point, Jeff, not only can God forgive us, but God can use us. God uses that people to further that mission in the world.
Okay, well, I'm just going to stir this up
Oh,
for
good.
another minute. About the subversiveness that remains in the Bible. Let me just talk about the canon of the New Testament. I just want to throw this out there as something to think about. I agree that Jesus' message was radical. But you will see, and this is something I love about our canon, you will see within our own canon the domestication of Jesus' radical message.
Yep.
Okay, think about that for a minute. Jesus' radical message about oppression and domination systems and, God's accessibility to everyone and radical, equality. That's part of what, open table fellowship, all of that. All of those things got him into trouble and ultimately got him killed. Within our own canon, if you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and how the narrative starts to be interpreted to accommodate the audiences of their day, some of the message of Jesus gets domesticated. And Paul does the same thing. In the letters of Paul, there are only some that go back to authentic Paul, as they say, and then others are written in his name that come later. And some of those later letters of Paul already start domesticating some of the social egalitarianism that Paul might have encouraged. Okay, so what fascinates me is that within our own canon, we see the domestication of Jesus' message.
Do you mean the watering down and softening to make it more
Watering
easy to
down,
live with?
softening, saying, yeah, maybe, but maybe we don't have to go that far.
Yeah.
It's just a figure of speech.
Perhaps that's how some texts go. But I think that's an interesting mirror for us.
Well, we can actually, in the book of Revelation, you can see some of that already taking place. Because let's take that maybe 100 years, 120 years after the resurrection. We already see women being displaced and stories cast about them that they're immoral or whatever the case might be that would undermine their authority. You can see that taking place in there. And that, indeed, is the human form of it. But there's an interesting book as an aside. There's a guy named Rodney Stark. I think he's at the University of Washington. And I believe, I think I've been told that he's not a believer, not a follower of Jesus. But he wanted to go to as a historian of the classic world, wanted to find out why the church grew so fast. How did it go from 12 people, or really 24 people if you count the women? I hope we do. If you go from 24 people to 500,000, 3 centuries later, 4 centuries later, how did that happen? One of the striking things you take away from that was that Christians acted like people who were not afraid of death. Now, I think that's one of the messages that you take away from the New Testament. It's a fundamental message. We are also loyal to our spouses and family and friends in a way that perhaps other groups did not urge. Now, believe me, pagans also practice loyalty. And there's some really good books that have come out about this lately. But Stark goes through this, like 5 or 6 different things that he talks about that Christians have taken away from their encounter with just Jesus of the New Testament.
He's a sociologist, and so he talks about what that first century world was like and how radical hospitality was expressed by Christian groups.
And there's several new books since then. One just came out, Philip Jenkins, who you've probably encountered without maybe even being aware of it, but Jenkins talks about the 2 centuries that are leading up to Jesus. And so you can see that sharpened focus, but what I'd like to urge you to see in here it's not the faith in Jesus that really matters here. It's the faith of Jesus. And if we practice that among ourselves, it's remarkable what the world will do. I think we have a failure of nerve, speaking only for the Episcopal Church. I can't speak for Presbyterians or Methodists, but when it comes to liturgy and use of the Bible, we should have had a new prayer book a long time ago. What is it? Page 13 in this prayer book in here authorizes as early as the 18th century we should update this prayer book at regular intervals. I would say from 1976 to 2016 is not a regular interval.
There ought to be a law.
There is a law.
There haven't been that many of them.
There is a law.
No, there haven't been that many of them. That's 4.
You know, speaking of language, maybe we should find a better word than subversive. Because that implies, in the same way that someone says maybe Black Lives Matter is radical or alt-left, maybe it's just true. Maybe it's just enlightened or something else. And I think language changes culture.
Well, Barb hasn't had a chance to speak. We're a little over time, so I'm going to give it to you, and then.
I want you to back up a slide
Okay.
because I see you struggle with this in ways maybe other people don't see you struggle. How your ordination vows and canons constrain you. So I just want to point that out.
Well, yeah, I had this slide up for quite a while you were all talking because it seemed to me that these were some of the points raised. You know, the last point, what's our appropriate relationship to the Bible? That's the last question on that particular slide. The first one is, you know, we have a responsibility. This was Bill Ellis's comment last week. We have a responsibility, those of us who are in the pulpit. We have a responsibility to do the work of interpreting and help clarify to a new people what these ancient texts were saying. These ancient texts written by and for an ancient people. And I don't have a lot of problem with thinking about the ancient society being patriarchal, and I'm pretty sure Jesus used the word kingdom because I think he was offering a contrast to the current kingdom at hand.
I agree.
And that's why Lord is such an important word. And so these are all the struggles I go through. I mean, if I lose Lord to talk about Jesus, then I lose the edge.
Right.
Because the edge is, he's saying, Caesar isn't your Lord.
That's right.
And that is not the kingdom we live in. And so that those ancient words, though masculine, are powerful and subversive. And I have no problem with subversive. I have no problem with radical. And I would remind some of you that the word radical is radix, it's root. I go right back to that very first slide. You know.
But Jed, how do you feel then that your ordination
Rooted.
limits what you do? Because to use the word Lord is not a bad thing if you educate us about why that was such an important word. And it's a title that was given to Caesar. So if that is a title given to Jesus, I mean, that ups the ante, okay? So as an ordained person myself, I don't feel limited at all in terms of, I mean, I wish I knew more. I wish I were a scholar.
Yeah. Well, I guess I come to something like the slide I had about the authorized translations. You know, there are rules that are kind of, you know, the canons are there. You use canon one way, and of course canons I'm thinking about are the laws that we have in the church. Those are the only ones I'm allowed to use, technically. And I break canon. I mean, I kind of stretch it to the breaking point already with liturgical stuff I do around here. But the texts are important to me. And if I just start using another text that isn't authorized, that's when I start getting a little nervous, to be honest. And
The process of authorization really speaks to this issue. It's done at General Convention.
Right.
You know, if you don't go to General Convention, if you don't represent this point of view, if you don't have a different aspect to this, then it isn't going to change. I mean, inertia is what governs all church traditions. We don't want to lose what we once had that was rich and complex, even while we know at the same time we must lose it if we're going to move on. And I agree about it. I'm not a hymnologist by any measure, but the hymnals, one of the reasons people have such a difficult time changing is they recognize at some splanchnic gut level that if you let that go, you ain't going to get it back. Right?
Well, this is the language of our devotion.
That's right.
And
It sinks into us.
And that's
Yeah.
a whole nother issue, you know.
Just a very small footnote, and it leads into worship today. The psalm back on August 20th was Psalm 133, and the first verse, "Oh, how good and pleasant it is when brethren live together in unity." And I changed it that Sunday morning to "God's people live in unity." And the brothers in question, why it was so effective as a responsorial psalm, was we had Joseph and his brothers. How good it would be if they lived together in unity. That was actually why it was such an effective and appropriate responsorial psalm. But that's not how most of us would hear it. And so I changed to God's people live together in unity that Sunday. And I put a footnote on it because I didn't do that even then lightly. And I thought it was maybe helpful to think about it. So let's continue to think about it, talk about it. It is way after 10, and I have to get Bess in and get the dogs lined up. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut this off.
Can we do this again?
Can we do this again sometime?
I think we should.
So A team meets later this week, and we'll talk about this, unpack this a little bit more, and talk about something else.